This week we promised to talk about the buildup for radical changes. This entire exercise in breaking down the conspiracy's agenda and implementation of that agenda has been to demonstrate that a force has been at work toward making radical changes in our society and government. What do we mean by radical changes? We mean the changes made in our Constitution and our form of government due to the 1912 and 1914 elections, the most dramatic changes in our history. For over 100 years, the Illuminati forces of the Jacobins and then the Carbonari worked in both Europe and the United States. They were led by members of the Illuminati. In America, the Jacobins formed the Democrat Party. The Carbonari formed Young America. In both instances, their main goal, outside of the regular Illuminati agenda, was to use the United States as part of the New World Order, first as part of France, but failing that, they planned to capture the government of the United States and use it to conquer the world in the name of manifest destiny. These plans failed. The first one nearly completely. The second goal needed a social upheaval in the American people, a radical change, something that would take time. To accomplish this, their agenda was implemented by 4 separate movements, but with interlocking leadership. These tactics were: 1. Flood the country with immigrants who had little or no concept of Americanism. Promote their political leaders who were radical socialists, communists, and get them voting as soon as possible. 2. Infiltrate American education to start the process of dumbing down American students away from the knowledge of their heritage. 3. They formed organizations designed to lower the basic morality and religious basis of the American people, the bedrock of Americanism. Included in this effort was to lower the responsibility level of the people as well. And 4, start a war on American soil to serve as a catalyst to alter American society and government. Number 1 never ceased in its application. The actual figures of immigration in those days probably were well over the official figures, just as it is today. These immigrants, by and large, provided votes for the more radical agenda, just as the bulk of immigrants do today. With number 2, the education system in metropolitan areas started to subtly change their curricula relative to civics and American government classes by not teaching certain aspects of American government rather than a head-on attack against the American system, dumbing down by omission rather than commission. As to number 3, the spiritualists and their allies produced a huge following that started to reject God and in the process reject the spiritual basis of our country, which, as stated in the Declaration of Independence, that our rights come from God, not a king or any government. Once a sizable number of people, coupled with the immigrants who never understood this, the stage was set for government to assume more powers, since too many people believed it was the government's right to do so. Number 4 was accomplished by starting the Civil War, from which we have never recovered. It produced regulatory agencies over our agriculture and mining. It started the process of building a so-called deep state in government, and continued American interference in other countries where we had no business interfering. All of this came together into a perfect storm, and in the ballot box by 1912 and then 1914. The real tragedy of the election of 1912 was that no matter who you voted for president, you were going to have some degree of socialism due to the candidates. It also set the stage for two government-altering constitutional amendments, the 16th and the 17th, plus the Federal Reserve. The 16th Amendment made it legal to tax the ordinary citizen and business directly by the federal government. The federal government had established the first income tax under Lincoln in the name of the war, but was stopped after the war. It was attempted again a few years later after the war, but was found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Our country's founders realized that to give the power to the federal government to directly tax the individual and business would give inordinate power to the government, not only to tax, but with which to control. The Constitution was written to prevent this. Thus, an amendment was needed to lift this barrier. The people had been prepared to accept this huge step in the power of the federal government. They could not extend the lines and realized what such a move would mean. Subsequently, we've seen the power to tax and control grow. The 17th Amendment altered our form of government from a divided Congress with two chambers, one representing the people and the other representing the state governments. Thus, the Congress was altered into representing the people only and directly. The Senate represented the state governments and were elected by the state governments. Once the 17th Amendment was ratified, the Senate no longer represented the states, since they were now elected by the people. It made a huge difference in our Republican form of government. The Senate no longer represented the state governments. There were also financial considerations which changed from the states making up the shortfall in the federal government to where the federal government started to finance the states. This financing came with little or no resistance from the state legislatures against federal interference and regulation within the states unauthorized by the Constitution. They'd been bought off. It turned state sovereignty on its head. Then, of course, came the Federal Reserve with its control over American money and finance. What was worth $1 in purchase power in 1914 became worth only 2 cents today in purchasing power. The people were told that their money was backed by gold, but in 1933 until 1974, no citizen could even own gold, only paper. The losing value of the spending power of the paper dollar, through the losing the value of the spending power of the paper dollar, the American people were robbed. The process was so subtle that no one really noticed much until it was too late. If it had been done over a year, we would have had another revolution, but it was done gradually over 100 years. Our monetary system is owned and controlled by a few unknown men who can make or break candidates in the federal government, which is supposed to oversee their activities. This constitutes another wing of the deep state. We know that our federal government began to build the deep state from the members of the Carbonary Young America and communists in our foreign service, beginning with President Pierce. Likewise, the same was done to our War Department under Lincoln. As a result, the process was started that led the state militias to become the National Guard, paid for by the federal government. Who pays the piper calls the tune, as they say. This diminished the power of the states due to the federal government control over what used to be the militia. Slowly but surely, the power of the federal government was accumulating and becoming more radical due to the 4 elements we outlined. And it was all done from the onset by Illuminist forces.